Here we go, 6.3, 6.4, starting with economics and the environment. So you can see an economy is a social system that converts resources into goods. And so you can see what I've written down, page 139. Economy, resources into goods and services, versus the economics that studies how people use the resources to provide those goods and services to others. All right? Economy, resources into goods and services. Economics study how people use those resources to provide those goods and services. All right. Picture down here is kind of a good visualization of what we're going to be kind of talking about, especially moving forward. A lot of the time, people are more focused in kind of this kind of beige area in here. They're not really worried about basically where it all goes to waste. They could care less about that part. And they also don't really like talking about the natural resources. So kind of the outside box with the environment, that gets kind of put on the back burner because the economy must be growing, it must be growing, it must be growing. People need to make money, people need to have jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the environment gets pushed to the back burner, unfortunately. All right, that's basically what I'm talking about right here. Typically, societies don't factor in what provides the source for the goods. Obviously, that's the environment. Okay, again, it gets pushed to the back burner. Like we were talking about the other day with the miners are getting kind of crappy service, or excuse me, crappy working conditions. They're put in harm's way. They're not properly taken care of, and so on. Then ecological degradation, that typically hurts the poor people first. So think not only in our country, those that have less are going to be put kind of in crummier neighborhoods with higher pollution that are near industrial areas and so on, so on, so on. But just in general, the developing nations, the poor in the developing nations, those are the ones that are really getting hurt the most, and they're getting hurt the first, or the first ones to get hurt. All right, next one, talking about economics. So there's kind of two general thought processes with economics. Either classical, where you can see the self-interest benefits society as long as laws restrain them. So basically think of like capitalism with, antitrust laws and, regulations for polluting and this, that, and the other. So basically self-interest, Jeff Bezos can make as much money as possible because it benefits society because of all the jobs that he creates. But we want to make sure that laws restrain them so they're not just going crazy. That's classical economics. Neoclassical looks at the psychological factors driving consumer choices. So like, why am I shopping at Whole Foods versus Safeway, or Albertsons versus Fred Meyer, or something like that? Like the literal brain psychology behind it. Why is that stuff changing? This also assumes people behave rationally and have full info. And that's the big hiccup. Because if you've ever been in a crowd of people, crowds don't behave rationally. And then if you ever go to the store, you're never going to have the full info about what you're buying. Like how the cow was treated before he was slaughtered for meat, or, how the chicken was raised for the eggs, or how the whatever, like how much pollution the company is going to be polluting, stuff like that. That's the full info we're talking about there. So these last two things, those are some pretty big assumptions that, in my opinion at least, are very, very hard to overcome. All right, cost benefit analysis. All right, this stuff works, but not all of the costs and the benefits can be easily identified. And that becomes kind of the hiccup with this thing. Because like you can see, obviously, like Jeff Bezos and the Amazon worker and the Amazon delivery driver, and they're making money and he's making a livable wage or whatever, whatever, whatever. But easily identified, like how many species were either displaced or have gone extinct because of all the big gigantic warehouses that Amazon has been building. Like that's the stuff. You can't just like easily like just quickly look that up. That's the stuff we're talking about right there. All right, now with environmental degradation, there are four fundamental assumptions that lead to it. All right, the first one is replacing resources. So basically the thought process is that we can replace those resources forever. So think of like, fresh water. Like, oh, don't worry, the earth will make warm fresh water, or it'll rain enough, it'll be okay, we'll be fine. That's the idea with the replacing resources. Okay, you can also think of the resources as the metal, or the minerals that go into your iPhones and the Teslas and the light bulbs and whatever. All of those resources, their thought process, we can basically replace them for forever. Second thing, external costs. So the assumption is that only the buyer and the seller are experiencing the transaction. All right, that's obviously false. Because if I'm buying an iPhone, it's not just like the iPhone worker and myself, or Apple and myself, that are experiencing the transaction. all of the miners in the third world countries and across the world that are mining for the minerals to put into my iPhone, those guys are having an experience as well, positive or negative. Moving on to 144. Okay. Third assumption, discounting. So basically, future goods and services aren't worth as much. So the example that the book gives, and you can see it right at the very top then, there, just as you might rather have an ice cream cone today than be promised one next month, market demand is greater for goods and services today. So kind of honestly, kind of one of the reasons I think Amazon has succeeded is because you can get that stuff delivered so fast. Like basically, I will pay the premium price right now because I'm going to get it now or tomorrow, rather than I'm not going to pay a premium price today and then I get it a year and a half later. That's the idea. So if somebody promises you, you can get this Tesla right now for $20,000, or you can get it used in 3 years for $14,000. That's the idea behind discounting, is that the future goods, the Tesla, aren't going to be worth as much. All right? So therefore, we need to kind of destroy the environment now in order to get the minerals now, in order to get the products made now. Economic growth, affluenza. Again, affluence is basically just wealth. Affluenza occurs when wealth gap increases. And I put, for example, Instagram. So as long as I'm starting to see that a lot of other people have a lot of money and therefore they're doing a lot of cool things and they got a lot of cool experiences and they got the big yacht and they got the cool car and they got the et cetera, I'm going to get affluenza. I'm going to be jealous of them. Okay, full transparency, my brother owns a Tesla. On the one hand, I don't really like Elon Musk, so on the one hand, I don't really want one, but I've driven in it and it's kind of awesome, and so I kind of want one. So I experience a little bit of that affluenza. All right, so we're going to talk about this paragraph right here. So we're talking about basically sustainable economic growth at this point. So can we conclude then that human ingenuity and technology will allow us to overcome all environmental constraints and continue economic growth indefinitely? So if you are a yes, you're a cornucopia. Okay, literally, like it says, means horn of plenty. So basically, you guys are more like optimistic. Okay, on the flip side, if you respond no, you're what's considered a Cassandra. Okay, named after the mystical princess of Troy with the gift of prophecy, whose dire predictions were not believed. So basically, think of it like kind of optimist, pessimist. And that's what I have written on the sticky note here on 145. So basically, you're either an optimist or you're a pessimist. Okay, a lot of people in the environmental science world are pessimistic about our outlook and kind of the future. To be honest, a lot of what I look at in the future, I'm pessimistic, but I kind of have to, kind of for my own sanity, be optimistic about it. Because if I just look around at all the environmental degradation that's going on, oh crap, we're all going to die next year. Or I can be like, you know what? As a human species, we've never let ourselves go extinct. We're going to figure out some sort of way to make it happen. So I'm kind of a mix of the two of them. Maybe I'm a would that be a cornisandra? Maybe that's what I am. I don't know. Here we go. Where are we at to next? 148. Okay, non-market values. So these are values not usually in the price of a good or a service, such as a scenic drive. So if you go down to, or if you drive over to Yellowstone, or go down to Yosemite, or you go to Australia, to the, whatever it is, okay, the non-market value, you're not going to say that, oh, you guys driving on this drive through Yosemite, we need to charge you an extra $40 because you're going on this road because that road is more pretty than the rest of them. Like, they don't do that kind of stuff. All right. There's also this thing called a contingent valuation, which is actually kind of cool. So surveys to see what people will pay to protect something. So, I live by Yosemite Valley, so I want to make sure it's protected. So I'm going to make, I'll pay an extra $100 in taxes a year to make sure that it stays untouched. Or I'd pay an extra 120, but 150 a year, I don't know about that. That's kind of what they're trying to ask with these surveys. So what they figured out is this, where's it talking about it? Right on the top here. On average, respondents said their households will pay $80 to $143 per year to prevent the predicted impacts. We're talking about basically like something happening poorly. Multiplying these factors by the number of households in Australia, the researchers found that the preservation was worth $435 to $777 million annually to Australia's population. Those numbers exceeded the $102 million in annual economic benefits expected from mine development, so the researchers concluded that it was in the best to preserve the land undeveloped. And that's the part where they're literally putting a market value on something that's typically not done. And that's kind of the cool idea behind this contingent valuation. If you ask a bunch of the Australians or the Americans or the Washingtonians or the Spaniards or whatever, how much they'd be willing to pay a little bit more in taxes to preserve it, and that's going to outweigh that $102 million development, then we'd leave it alone. That's the idea behind it. So calculating the value of ecosystem services in dollars makes people appreciate it more. And that's kind of going back up to what we're talking about up here. If you can basically put a value in dollars, kind of hard numbers, so they can compare one thing to another, then it starts to kind of become a little bit more real to people. So this diagram down here does a pretty good job of that. So you can see all the ecosystem services are on the y-axis there. So you can see purifying air. The x-axis, total global value per year in trillions of dollars. So purifying air is worth about $1 trillion. But you can see like providing habitat, that's worth $11 trillion. Treating waste, that's almost $23 trillion. So if you can start to put this into the conversation when you're talking about the economy, then we can really start having some better discussions with the environment being protected, kind of being at the forefront of this whole thing. All right, so GDP. A lot of people talk about the GDP of this country and the GDP of that country and so on. So what GDP is gross domestic product. So the total monetary value of all goods and services. So Apple and Tesla and AT&T and T-Mobile and the Seahawks and whatever, all the big companies that are based in one country, all are contributing to this gross domestic product. So let's say that Apple sells, $1 billion worth of iPhones. The gross domestic product is $1 billion plus whatever iPhone or whatever the AT&T did, and then whoever, and so on, so on, so on. You just add it up. So right now, currently, America has the highest GDP in the world because basically we have the most big companies with us. Is kind of the idea. Now there's another thing called the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator. This is the differentiates between desirable and undesirable economic activity. This picture right here is actually a really good example of it. So oil spills like this one along the coast of Santa Barbara actually increase the GDP. Because again, all it is, the GDP is just simply the total monetary value of all goods and services. The picture, these guys are cleaning something up, that's a service. They are spending money on that service, therefore the GDP is going up. But that's not really a good thing. Like, that's not a positive thing to really be bragging about. Our GDP is pretty awesome. Only 5% of it was going to clean up environmental disasters. You don't want to talk about that stuff. And so that's where that GPI, that Genuine Progress Indicator, comes in. They're going to differentiate between the good things, like selling iPhones, for example, versus the undesirable, which is cleaning up oil spills. All right, this can be a subjective thing, so that's why a lot of people aren't actually big fans of it, but I think it's a pretty good thing. So you can see right here, okay, this is talking about the components of the GDP and the GPI. Okay, so GDP is $7.6 trillion. The benefits are ignored by the GDP is 4.7. And so you can see basically if you bring this all down, basically kind of think of these are all the bad things, it brings it down to the total kind of the real GDP in quotation marks would be 4.4 trillion. All right. Now, again, like I was talking about with subjectivity, critics don't really like the GPI because ideology drives policy, or basically what you see as good versus bad or desirable and undesirable can change based on kind of who's making the decisions. All right. Now, market failure can be avoided through government actions. Obviously, that's one of the things that they're trying to do right now with inflation, with the Fed raising interest rates, stuff like that. That's what they're trying to do. They can kind of make sure that market failure does not occur, thankfully, because these are the guys that are charged with the big banks and things like that. All right. Empowering consumers is a big part of government action. All right. You basically got to make sure that the consumer, A, has as much information as possible, has enough options. So if I don't want to go to Target and Amazon, I need to have the option to go to other companies. That's where a lot of this antitrust lawsuit comes in, because you don't want, like, Amazon buying up, all Albertsons and Safeway and Fred Meyer and Whole Foods and um, I can't even think of another grocery store, Trader Joe's. Like, if Amazon controls all of it, our ability for as a consumer to be empowered to kind of shop, like competitive shop, goes away. All right. As well as the companies will bend to consumer desires. So if all of the consumers are starting to say, hey, I want things that are from companies that are more sustainable, and that's when we start spending our money, the companies will start bending to or accommodating or trying to kind of like start to appease the consumers. But that will lead to a thing called greenwashing potentially. So this is pretending to be doing best practices, but not actually doing them. So if you've actually ever been to the store and you've seen things that are marked as natural, that is a great definition of greenwashing. There is no actual definition that anybody has to meet in order to put natural on their products. So like I could sell some bird poop and be like, hey, it's all natural. It is, but that's not a good thing. Sustainable development. Okay, this is progress that maintains resources. So this is basically thinking about, you want to make sure that you're buying your timber for your house from a sustainable timber farm, and then you want to make sure that timber gets transported to your house by an electric vehicle, and then you want to make sure, and that kind of stuff. So basically, you're making sure that it maintains the resources rather than pulling from it. That's what sustainable development is all about. All right, Tay, leave me one question. That way we have something to talk about tomorrow. And make sure the question is actually about the content. Don't ask me about what my favorite dinosaur is or that you're hungry. All right, see you guys Friday.